Thank you, Grant, for getting us off to a good start this morning, and welcome to our second week of our virtual service, the second week of our self-imposed quarantine out of respect for our government and the leaders and their requests that we not meet in groups larger than 10. Let's continue to pray for our leaders, pray for our nation, pray for people around us, and ask God to spare us from the worst, to spare us from thinking that we can do this ourselves, and that He would intervene in our lives and in our nation. Well, with that in mind, I was drawn to another one of the things that Jesus taught, a parable. Last week we looked at Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, saw a piece of that. This week I want to have us consider one of Jesus' parables. Really, it's one of His most famous parables, the parable that we often call the parable of the prodigal son. In my Bible, it's the parable of the lost son, a story that Jesus tells us so that we will understand more about God and how we relate to Him. And I'm going to read from Luke chapter 15. Most of this parable, as I read it, I think I'll stop a little bit now and then to kind of comment on things that come to my mind as I read. Again, Luke chapter 15, starting at verse 11, Jesus continued. Actually, this is His third story about lostness. The lost sheep, the lost coin, and now the lost son. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he, that would be the father, divided his property between them. I read that and I can easily go fast through it without stopping to realize that when this younger son asks for his share of the estate, it's really like saying to his dad, "Dad, I wish you were dead and I could have the money that I'm due." That is not respectful, even in our ears, let alone the ears of first century Jewish life. That young man would have marked himself out as a rebellious, disgraceful son. And those listening to this story would have thought to themselves, that kid is terrible. He is a disgrace to his father. Well, let's go on back to the story as Jesus tells it to us. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. Let me stop there for just a minute and let you know that that word squandered is really the word for prodigal. When I was young and I heard about the story of the prodigal son, I thought it was the story of rebellious, disgraceful son. But actually the word prodigal means wasteful. And so this son who had his wealth from his father goes and he wastes it. He's a prodigal son, a wasteful son, or as this translation says, he squandered his wealth in wild living. It's interesting, Jesus doesn't tell us a lot of details about that wild living, probably because we don't need them. We already know what he's talking about. Okay, back to verse 14. After he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. Now, we in our culture realize that pork is a good meat. In fact, it's healthy, and we don't have any cultural problems with that. But in the Jewish culture, pork was anathema. You don't eat pork. And so for this young man to be so low that he would feed pigs. It's Jesus' way of describing him at rock bottom. He hit bottom. Some of it was his fault, his wild living, but some of it wasn't his fault. It just came because there was a famine in that country, and he had no resources with which to meet that famine. Okay, Jesus' story goes on. While he was feeding the pigs, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Jesus continues, verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death?" We would say the only food he had was the slop he fed the pigs. Verse 18, he continues, talking to himself now, "I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father." Notice, he recognized he was a sinner. He recognized that not only was he sinning against his father and his family, but also against God. Jesus continues now with the story. "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to his father, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." What a great story. I know, I'm ending before Jesus ended. But that's okay. Let's look at this story together.